Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the History of Christianity. We are on part 10. We'll be looking today at the last great persecution of the ancient church, and that's going to set the stage for what will happen moving beyond this time of persecution and being outlawed. We start by looking at Emperor Diocletian. So Diocletian came into power early in the 4th century, and with him came the last great persecution of the Christian church. Although it didn't look like that was the way it was going to be at first. Emperor Diocletian was enjoying a period of relative peace and prosperity in the Roman Empire. Things were going really well. In fact, Diocletian's wife and daughter were Christians. So if there was any time that it seemed like the church would be spared from persecution, you would have thought that it would have been during a time of peacefulness and when the emperor had such close relationships with actual practicing Christians as his wife and daughter. But that's not the way things turned out. Galerius was in power with Diocletian directly under the emperor's authority, and he did not want Christians in the military. The reason for this is that most church leaders said that Christians should not be involved in the military. But there were a lot of Christians throughout the Roman legions, and Galerius thought that this was a conflict. And so he made a big move with Diocletian to get rid of all the Christians out of the military. He asked the emperor to expel all Christians from military service. This was around AD 295, so just before entering into the 4th century. At that time, a number of Christians were executed, some for refusing to join the army. There was a compulsion for some to join the army that they said because of their religious beliefs that they would not. There were some of those that were executed, and then, interestingly enough, also those that refused to leave it. And then there were many who were executed for refusing to deny their faith. So kind of the same thing we've seen time and time again, these periods of peace that happened throughout the 2nd, the 3rd, and into the 4th century would be broken up eventually by someone who came along, wanted to stir the pot for whatever reason, and it was always seemingly the Christians who bore the brunt of this. In AD 303, Diocletian issued a new edict against Christians prohibiting them from positions of responsibility. He was being influenced by those around him that these Christians would not be dependable. We don't want them in positions of power. We can't necessarily trust them to put the empire above everything else. Certainly they won't put it above their own personal beliefs. So let's get them out of these positions. That then moved to an order that all Christians be removed from government positions and that Christian buildings and books be destroyed. So things are escalating. Diocletian is taking this another step further. Galerius is a big reason for that. Many of the Christians refuse to turn over their sacred writings. We have to remember that these writings are very precious. In our day and time, if a book gets lost, I just go buy a new one, or I can get online if I've got an electronic device and I can download the book onto my Kindle or iPad or whatever it is. We all know that they didn't have those at that time, but it's hard for us to really understand how important it was to keep these writings. If they were lost, you might not be able to get them again. Not to say that there weren't other copies around, but there was no guarantee you would ever have a copy of it or that anyone near you would. They were meticulously copied time and time again. That's why we have the writings we do today. Obviously the Bible, the New Testament, but even other Christian writings that exist from that time period. These Christians put such a great responsibility on themselves to make sure that the teaching that those writings represented and the message of them were passed down to us to this day. And many of these Christians were tortured and put to death as a result. Another incident took place. Fire broke out twice in the imperial palace. Galerius blamed the Christians for this. In retaliation, I guess, some of the Christians, writers of that day, said that Galerius actually started the fires himself in order to blame the Christians and escalate things against them. Could it have happened? It could have. We don't know that for sure. But these writers, whether it was because they wanted to get revenge on him or whether they really knew it to be true or suspected it to be true, said it was Galerius, but it didn't really matter what they thought. What did matter was what Galerius said and what Diocletian thought. Diocletian demanded after that all Christians in the imperial court must offer sacrifice before the gods. He was going to start by taking care of his house first. And there were Christians in the imperial court. Already talked about his wife and his daughter. So his wife's name was Prisca, and his daughter's name was Valeria. And they complied. They went along with this. So they moved away from their faith. They offered sacrifice before the gods in order to be in compliance. There was another person in the court then, the Grand Chamberlain Dorotheus. And there were several others as well that refused, and they were martyred. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. They didn't go along with it, and they were martyred for their faith. Well, this set off a rash of persecution against Christians throughout the empire. Churches and sacred writings were being torched, and Christians were being executed all over the place. That brings us to this period of history known as the Great Persecution. Diocletian became convinced Christians were conspiring against him. Obviously, he had some voices in his ear telling him this, but his own paranoia, he decided they were out to get him, and he didn't want to have anything to do with that. So he ordered church leaders arrested and demanded that all Christians must offer sacrifice to the gods. We've gone through this study time and time again. What happens when these orders are made? It really depends on that group. What we've seen is that groups that have had to deal with persecution already tended to resist, but groups that have been more or less in peaceful times, they didn't necessarily do so well, and that happened again this time. But we do also have to remember that this was the most cruel persecution that the ancient church had ever known. It was unleashed now. Some horrific things. We're not going to get into those today. You can read further about them if you'd like to. But some really awful things happened to people, not just torture, not just death, but in ways that no one could ever even conceive of dying or being tortured. That wasn't something that a lot of these people were willing to face. Efforts were made to force Christians to abandon their faith. Obviously, the thought that you might die or be horrifically tortured is going to be a motivating factor in this. And there were many of them who never had faced persecution. They had heard about it, but they hadn't had to deal with it themselves. They succumbed. They went ahead and did what they were told to do by leaving their faith behind, making sacrifice to the gods. We can look at them as not having been faithful. Obviously, God is the judge, not us. And certainly that's correct. But don't forget, for us today, we've never faced anything like this either. And I wonder how many of us, if we really, I know we all say, I'd go to the death. I wonder how many there would be really that would go that far, that would say, okay, I'm willing to die in a horrific way. I'm willing to be tortured in an awful way. I'm willing to be taken from my family. I believe that about myself, but I don't know that for sure because I've never had to face it. So I'm not going to judge these people too harshly. They did a wrong thing. God's the judge of them. He knows their hearts. God can forgive them. I don't know if they asked for forgiveness. I don't know if any of them came back. I'm sure there were some that did, or at least tried to. I'm just saying for us, wait till you've walked in the shoes of somebody that's had to deal with this before you get too judgmental about it. We can definitely all agree on this, though. We can have great respect and love in our hearts for those who refused to relent. And when they did, it wasn't a threat that was not taken up. They were tortured in these horrible ways, and they were killed in equally cruel ways. Many of them didn't get to die a quick death, certainly not a painless death. They were painful deaths, and they were not quick. And the purpose behind that was to dissuade someone from going along that same path. That's one of the reasons that the Christian martyrs were such a big influence on people as far as bringing them into Christianity. The very effect that the leaders thought that those kind of deaths would have actually made the opposite effect, because people saw these individuals who were willing to go through something that nobody would go through if they could do anything about it. And they did it willingly. And that made a big impression. It's one of the main reasons that Christianity spread the way that it did in the ancient world. But there are other Christians who went into hiding. They took the sacred writings with them to protect them. Some even left the empire and went outside the borders to escape this persecution. It was horrible. It continued on until AD 304. Galerius took power from Diocletian at that time. Diocletian became ill. He didn't really necessarily want to give up the throne right away. Galerius tried to kind of talk him into it, sweet talk him into it. Eventually, he started threatening him. Diocletian decided it's not worth this, and he stepped down, and Galerius took over. Well, you can imagine that didn't make things better. That made things worse. This began a period of political turmoil in the Roman Empire. Many factions in the empire did not agree with this. Other people in positions of authority thought it probably should have been them, or they should have more power. So it's a great time of upheaval, but with all of that going on, the Christians continue to be persecuted. This is a dark time in Christian history. The ancient church, if you read the writings of the historians of that time, it was a time that they were not sure they were going to survive. They really thought that there was a chance they were going to be wiped off the face of the earth. And it very well could have happened, but then things changed. God intervened. And it led to the final victory of the church over persecution. There was another ruler at this time who was on a level with Galerius, not quite maybe as high as him, but very close. His name was Constantius Chlorus. He was the main political rival to Galerius. Constantius Chlorus had a son that I know you've heard his name, Constantine, one of the major figures in history, and certainly one of the most important figures in Christian history. So Constantius Chlorus opposed Galerius, and his son, Constantine, he was waiting for the right opportunity to strike back at Galerius. He kind of waited in the background, biding his time. He had power, he had authority, he was building up an army as well. He was waiting for the right time to strike. In the West, Constantine held the most power. And under his rule, Christians were not persecuted. Even during the time of Diocletian, Constantius Chlorus did not persecute Christians, certainly not on the level that was happening throughout the rest of the empire. So this was kind of the place that was safe for the Christians. Constantine did not go forward with the persecution, but the rest of the empire did until this happened. In AD 311, Galerius became ill with a painful disease. And some of the prominent Christian writers, philosophers, leaders of that day, they got the word out to him that he was being punished by God because of what he had done to the Christians. And this gave him a change of heart. He started thinking maybe he was, because he was going through a very painful time of disease in his life and was near death. At that time, Galerius made an edict that ended the persecution of Christians for the most part. Not completely, we'll see that in just a moment, but for the most part, he ended that time of persecution. But it didn't save his life. 5 days later, Galerius died. And in his place, the empire was divided among these four guys: Licinius, Maximinus Daia, Maxentius, and Constantine. These were the guys that divided up the empire. Of these, only Maximinus Daia continued persecuting Christians. So this was the last period of time. It was only under one of these guys, so it was not widespread, but in his part of the empire, Maximinus Daia continued the persecution of the Christians. And this would be known then as the final persecution for the ancient Christian church. Everything changed after this. And it changed because of the rise of Emperor Constantine. Constantine had waited for his time, and he seized this moment. He decided this is the correct moment. He had built an army, and it was time to make his move. So Constantine gathered his troops, he crossed the Alps, and he marched on Rome. And this is what some church historians tell us. The day before Constantine went to battle for the empire, he had his soldiers place the Greek letters Chi and rho on their shields and standards. The chi and rho are the first two Greek letters in the name of Christ. This was done in order for him to honor Christ. We have two Christian historians that tell us about this, Lactantius and Eusebius. They wrote that Constantine was told by God to do this. Lactantius said that God told him this in a dream, and Eusebius said that it happened in a vision. So whether it was a dream or a vision, we don't know for sure. But they said that God told Constantine to put these symbols on his soldiers in order to ensure victory. That was the story Constantine said as to why he did it. And the army of Constantine defeated the army of Maxentius. And that gave Constantine control of the entire western half of the Roman Empire, big chunk of it. In AD 313, Constantine met with Licinius to form an alliance. Part of their agreement was to end the persecution of Christians and give them back their churches, cemeteries, and other properties. That agreement is very important historically. It's known as the Edict of Milan. There was more to it than just this part, but for the interest of Christian history, this was the part that was most important. It officially ended the persecution of the ancient church. It never happened again. And soon, we already know, Constantine would take control of the entire Roman Empire. We'll look at that in the next section. Before we move on to that next section, let's look at some conclusions to this period of time. This ends the first chapter in the history of Christianity. So if you look at that time from when Christianity was brought to this world by Jesus Christ, then his message was passed down by the apostles to their disciples. The church began to be formed, and the disciples of the apostles passed their message down. Throughout that 2nd century, 3rd century, and 4th century AD, this is what I would call the golden age of Christianity. Now, you may be thinking, that doesn't make a lot of sense, because this is the time when the church was persecuted the most, and that's true. But what we're going to find out is, as they moved away from that time of persecution, things didn't get better necessarily for the church. They kind of got worse. It was a great victory. It's wonderful not to have to be under the threat of persecution. It's wonderful not to be under the threat of death. But now, because of the way it happened, we're going to see a period of time that there are new and greater difficulties coming for the church. The eventual conversion of Constantine had enormous consequences for Christianity. One point of history and understanding I think is important to know. Even though Constantine put those Christian symbols on his soldiers when he went to battle, he was not fully converted to Christianity. He still came back in when he took control and even worshiped the sun. And he didn't fully come around till later on. It was a process for him. So don't think that that event was his full conversion. I think it was a step in the road, a step down that path for Constantine. It didn't happen overnight. Constantine wasn't there yet, but God was getting him there. His conversion had some enormous consequences for Christianity. We're going to find out in the next section. Think about this. Those who had sacrificed so much for their faith, most of them were from low social standing. Throughout all of Christian history, even though we did have the writers, the philosophers, who maybe were on a little bit higher tier socially, there weren't really a lot that would have been a part of the aristocracy, and certainly not the ruling class. But now that's all about to change. These lower class of people in social standing are now going to be surrounded by imperial pomp and power. It changes things extremely. These same people who stood up to torture and were threatened with death, soon they're going to be tempted with a life of ease and social prestige. It doesn't go that well necessarily, and certainly the further they get away from the time of being under constant pressure, it gets a whole lot easier to slip into that life of ease and social prestige. The ramifications of these events and the transition of the church from that outsider, even outlaw group, to becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, it changed the Christian church radically. We're going to see that as we go through the rest of the study. Things really change. People don't like change. I don't necessarily like change. change can be good. And we do know things have to change. Things can't always stay the same. We can be idealistic about this period of time in Christian history, but it had to move beyond that. Things couldn't continue the way they were indefinitely. So change isn't necessarily bad, but it also is not in and of itself necessarily good. We're going to see both sides of it. We'll see the good parts that come from this, but we're also going to see a lot of bad parts, because these events, if I'm looking back in history, my opinion, what happened here and the ramifications of it eventually lead to the dawn of the Protestant Reformation. The church having to be radically changed to the extent that there actually had to be a group to leave the church. The seeds of that are sown with what's going to happen now. As the church becomes officially a part of the Roman Empire and high political, powerful figures become in play in the church leadership, it changes things a lot. We'll move on to that section next week. We're going to look at the imperial church. No longer that group of outlaw Christians, but now it becomes the official church of the empire. And specifically, we're going to look very much in depth in the next part of the study at Constantine. His life, his taking of power in the Roman Empire, his conversion experience, and what he did as a result of that, and how that changed things so much. It didn't happen overnight. But as the years go on, things really change. And we can even look at that in our day today as well. As Westerners, we are Christians who are still living in this time of peace that formed as a result of these events, so that we can practice our faith without hostility for the most part. And when I mean hostility, I'm talking about real hostility. I'm not talking about somebody laughing at you, or even if you lose a job promotion or a family member gets mad. I'm talking about your life being at stake. I'm talking about you could be put in jail. I'm talking about you could be tortured. I'm talking about somebody's coming after to burn your church down, take away everything that you've got. We don't really have that now. There can be little pockets of, as we look throughout history, and certainly when the Protestant Reformation happened, Christians began to be persecuted again, this time not by pagans, but by other Christians. But we're not, those are blips on the radar. We're still living in this time of peace, and things have changed. It's not the same. We don't understand what it was like to have that kind of faith, because we never had to have it. So we're moving past that section. Whether you agree with that or not, it doesn't matter. And we're moving on now next week to that next section, the next section of the study, the imperial church. Again, I want to just thank you for coming and being a part of this today. I hope that you enjoyed this time. This is a little bit shorter section, but it's very necessarily, it's a setup for what's to come, and very necessary to see. And we've honored once again those who gave their lives up. We don't know all their names. We know some of them. I've tried to include as many names of these martyrs as I could, because I think we need to honor them and remember them. They paid the ultimate price, and God is going to give them a special place of honor. They already have it. We'll see it one day because of what they were willing to give up. They didn't necessarily ask for it. We're not going to ask for it now either. But still, they had to live through it. That was their time. And we honor them and give great respect and love to them. Let us not forget as well that there are our brothers and sisters around the world who are not living in this time of peace. They are in countries that they are living much like these early Christians lived. Interestingly enough, Christianity is thriving in those countries because of the persecution. But they are having to give their lives up. They are in danger. They are being persecuted. They are being jailed. They are being tortured. They are being killed. Let us say a prayer for our brothers and sisters around the world and hold them with love in our hearts because of what they are willing to do for the faith. Thank you again for joining me today. I look forward to being back with you again next week. God bless.